The blood was freezing to Natalie Rogers' skin before she could even feel the pain anymore, which seemed like a small mercy until she realized it meant she was dying. 22 years old and left for dead on the side of a snow-covered mountain pass 15 miles outside Provo, Utah, in January of 1884, because her stepmother had finally decided that sharing her father's inheritance was too much of an inconvenience. The wagon tracks were already disappearing under fresh snowfall, and Natalie's vision blurred as she tried to focus on anything that might give her hope. But there was only white emptiness stretching in every direction. Her father had died 6 months ago, leaving behind a modest ranch and enough money to keep it running for several years if managed properly. Margaret Rogers, the woman he had married only 2 years prior, had smiled sweetly at the funeral and held Natalie's hand like a devoted stepmother should. But once the lawyer read the will and Natalie learned she would inherit half of everything when she turned 23, Margaret's mask had slipped. The argument started small, passive comments about Natalie eating too much or taking up too much space in the house that had been her childhood home. Then came the deliberate cruelties, the locked doors on cold nights, the meals that appeared only after everyone else had eaten their fill, the constant reminders that Natalie was a burden nobody wanted. This morning, Margaret had woken her before dawn and said they needed to travel to Salt Lake City to sign papers at the bank. Natalie had been so desperate to believe her stepmother might be softening, might be willing to find some peace between them, that she climbed into the wagon without question. They had driven for hours into the mountains, Margaret saying the regular road was washed out and they needed to take the high pass. When they stopped for what Margaret claimed was a wagon wheel check, Natalie had climbed down to stretch her legs. She never saw the rock that cracked against the back of her skull. She woke to find herself being dragged through the snow, her stepmother's face twisted with effort, and something that looked almost like regret but not quite enough to stop what she was doing. Margaret had pulled her nearly 50 feet from the road, far enough that anyone passing would not notice a body unless they were specifically looking. Then she had stripped Natalie of her heavy coat, her good boots, and even the wool shawl that had been a gift from her father. Margaret had stood over her, breathing hard in the thin mountain air, and said only 4 words before she left. "You understand? I'm sure." Natalie did not understand. She did not understand how someone could look at another human being, someone they had lived with and broken bread with for 2 years, and decide their life was worth less than money and property. She did not understand how her fingers had already gone numb, or how the cold had stopped feeling like cold and started feeling like fire burning through her veins. She did not understand why she had been so foolish, so desperately hopeful that Margaret might care for her even a little bit. The snow was falling harder now, thick flakes that caught in her eyelashes and melted on her lips. She tried to move, to drag herself back toward the road, but her body would not obey her mind. Her dress was thin cotton, meant for indoor wear, and it was already soaked through from the snow. The gash on the back of her head throbbed with each heartbeat, and she could feel something warm and sticky matting her dark hair despite the cold. She thought about her father, about how he used to take her riding through these same mountains in summer when wildflowers covered the meadows and the air smelled like pine and sunshine. She thought she might like to die remembering summer. But dying, as it turned out, was harder than simply closing your eyes and drifting away. Her body fought even as her mind began to fog, her lungs pulling in breath after painful breath, her heart continuing its steady rhythm despite every reason to stop. She did not know how long she lay there. Time became meaningless, measured only in the accumulation of snow on her body and the gradual fading of sensation in her limbs. The sound of hoofbeats did not register at first. Her ears had stopped working properly, or perhaps her brain had simply stopped processing information that did not directly relate to the fact that she was freezing to death. But then a shadow fell across her face, blocking out the gray sky, and a voice cut through the howling wind. "Jesus Christ." Strong hands touched her throat, feeling for a pulse, and then moved to brush snow from her face. Natalie tried to open her eyes, managed to get them to slits, and saw a man kneeling beside her. He was young, maybe 25 or 26, with dark hair and a face that might have been handsome if it was not currently twisted with alarm and concern. He wore a heavy sheepskin coat and leather gloves, and his horse stood behind him, a big buckskin gelding that stamped nervously at the snow. "Can you hear me?" the man asked, his face close to hers. His breath created clouds of vapor in the frozen air. "Miss, can you hear me at all?" Natalie tried to speak, but managed only a sound, somewhere between a whisper and a groan. It was enough. The man moved quickly, stripping off his coat and wrapping it around her, then lifting her as carefully as he could. She cried out despite herself when he moved her, the change in position sending fresh agony through her head and body. "I know," he said, his voice steady, despite his obvious haste. "I know it hurts, but I have to get you out of here. My ranch is only 3 miles from here. You hold on, you hear me? You hold on, and I'll get you somewhere warm." He managed to get her onto his horse, climbing up behind her and holding her against his chest with one arm while he guided the buckskin with the other. Natalie drifted in and out of consciousness as they rode, aware only of warmth against her back and the steady rhythm of hoofbeats beneath her. Once she felt herself starting to slip from the saddle, but the arm around her tightened and a voice spoke close to her ear. "Stay with me. We are almost there." The ranch house appeared through the snow like something from a dream, a solid 2-story structure with smoke rising from the chimney and lamplight glowing in the windows. The man shouted as they approached, and a door flew open, spilling golden light across the snow. Another man appeared, older, with gray in his beard and a face weathered by decades of mountain winters. "Yates, what in God's name happened?" the older man demanded, already moving to help. "Found her on the pass road, about 3 miles up," Yates said, sliding down from the saddle with Natalie still in his arms. "She has been out there a while. Get the guest room warm and heat some water. We need to warm her slow, or we will lose her." Yates Finnegan carried Natalie into the house and up a narrow staircase to a small bedroom that smelled like cedar and lemon oil. He laid her carefully on the bed, while the older man, who he called William, built up the fire in the small stove and brought blankets. A woman appeared, round-faced and motherly, who made distressed noises and immediately began helping Yates remove Natalie's frozen clothing. "This girl has been beaten," the woman said, her voice sharp with anger as she discovered the bruises on Natalie's arms and the wound on her head. "This was not an accident. I found her 50 feet from the road," Yates said quietly. "Someone put her there." They worked efficiently, wrapping Natalie in layers of dry blankets and placing heated stones wrapped in cloth near her body, but not directly touching her skin. The woman, whose name was Sarah and who turned out to be William's wife, cleaned the wound on Natalie's head with gentle hands and bandaged it with strips of clean linen. Throughout it all, Natalie floated in a gray place between consciousness and oblivion, aware of voices and touches but unable to respond or fully wake. The first time she truly woke, it was dark outside, and a lamp burned low on the bedside table. Her body ached in ways she had not known were possible, a deep, bone-level pain that made even breathing difficult. But she was warm, blessedly warm, wrapped in what felt like a dozen blankets with a fire crackling nearby. She turned her head slowly, testing her neck, and found Yates Finnegan sitting in a chair beside the bed. He was reading a book by the lamplight, his dark hair falling across his forehead, and he did not notice immediately that she had woken. Natalie took the opportunity to study him properly. He had a strong profile, with a straight nose and a firm jaw covered in a few days' worth of stubble. His hands, holding the book, were large and work-roughened, but moved with surprising gentleness as he turned pages. He wore a simple cotton shirt and wool vest, and in the lamplight she could see that his eyes were a deep brown, almost black. As if sensing her gaze, he looked up and met her eyes. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then he carefully marked his place in the book and set it aside, leaning forward in his chair. "You are awake," he said unnecessarily. "How do you feel?" "Like I should be dead," Natalie whispered, her voice hoarse and strange in her own ears. A flicker of something crossed his face. Might have been anger or pain or both. You came close. Another hour and you would have been. I'm Yates Finnegan. This is my family's ranch. Natalie Rogers. The words came automatically. A lifetime of polite introductions making her respond even in her current state. Thank you for saving my life. Can you tell me what happened? He asked, gently. Who did this to you? The whole story spilled out, halting at first and then faster, as if saying it out loud might somehow make it less real. She told him about her father's death, about Margaret's growing cruelty, about waking up in the snow with nothing but her thin dress and the certain knowledge that her stepmother had tried to kill her. Yates listened without interrupting, his expression growing darker as she spoke. Your stepmother left you to die for an inheritance, he said when she finished, his voice flat with barely controlled fury. She struck you, stole your clothes, and abandoned you on a mountain pass in the middle of winter. Yes. Natalie felt tears burning her eyes but refused to let them fall. She had cried enough in the past 6 months, cried herself to sleep more nights than not. She would not cry now, not in front of this stranger who had saved her life. We need to notify the sheriff, Yates said, standing up and pacing to the window. She cannot be allowed to get away with attempted murder. She has already gotten away with it, Natalie said bitterly. By now, she will have told everyone that I decided to take the stage to California or that I ran off with some man. She will play the concerned stepmother so well that no one will question her. And even if they did, it is her word against mine. Who is going to believe that a respectable widow tried to kill her stepdaughter? Yates turned back to her, his jaw tight. I believe you. Those 3 words, spoken with such simple conviction, nearly undid her composure completely. Natalie bit her lip hard enough to hurt and nodded. Thank you. Rest, he said, returning to his chair. We will figure out what to do in the morning. For tonight, you are safe here. You do not have to stay, Natalie said, though part of her desperately wanted him to. The room was warm and secure, but the thought of being alone in the darkness made her chest tight with panic. I know, Yates said, picking up his book again. But I am going to anyway. She slept, waking periodically throughout the night to find him still there, sometimes reading, sometimes simply sitting and watching the fire. Each time, the sight of him filled her with a relief so profound, it was almost painful. When morning light finally crept through the curtains, she woke to find Sarah bringing in a tray with broth and soft bread. You need to eat, Sarah said, her voice kind but firm. Your body has been through a terrible ordeal and needs nourishment to heal. Yates had disappeared sometime during the night, and Natalie felt his absence like a physical thing, a coldness that had nothing to do with temperature. She ate the broth obediently, finding that she was ravenously hungry despite everything. Sarah sat with her, chatting about neutral topics like the weather and the ranch, clearly trying to keep Natalie's mind occupied. How long have you worked here? Natalie asked between spoonfuls of broth. Oh, I do not work here, dear, Sarah said with a smile. William and I own the ranch next to this one. We have been neighbors with the Finnegan family for near 20 years now. When Yates's father passed 3 years ago, we sort of adopted him and his brother. Someone has to make sure those boys eat properly and do not work themselves to death. His brother? Marcus. He is in town today, picking up supplies. You will meet him tomorrow probably. He is a good boy, younger than Yates by 2 years. Sarah's expression grew more serious. Yates told us what happened to you. That woman who did this should be horsewhipped. I doubt anyone will believe me if I try to tell them, Natalie said quietly. Well, you have friends now who believe you, Sarah said firmly, and that counts for something. Over the next few days, Natalie slowly regained her strength. The frostbite on her fingers and toes was not severe enough to cause permanent damage, though the doctor who Yates brought from town said it had been a very close call. The wound on her head healed cleanly, though she would have a scar hidden beneath her hair. The bruises faded from purple to green to yellow, and her body gradually stopped aching with every movement. Yates was a constant presence, though he clearly tried to give her space and privacy. He brought her books from his father's library when she grew bored with staying in bed. He sat with her in the evenings and told her stories about growing up on the ranch, about his father teaching him to break horses, and his mother, who had died when he was 12, teaching him to read. He asked her questions about her own life, listening with genuine interest as she told him about growing up in Provo, about her mother who had died when Natalie was 7, about her father's quiet love and the way he had tried to fill both parental roles after they became just the two of them. He should not have remarried, Natalie said one evening as they sat in the parlor. Sarah had declared her well enough to leave the bedroom, though she still moved slowly and tired easily. He was lonely, I know, but Margaret was wrong from the start. I saw it, but I thought if I just tried harder to be a good daughter to her, she would come to care for me. That was not your fault, Yates said. He was sitting across from her, whittling a piece of wood into what looked like it might become a horse. You cannot make someone be kind. That has to come from inside them. I know that now. Natalie watched his hands move, precise and sure, shaving away thin curls of wood. What are you making? Not sure yet, he admitted with a small smile. Sometimes I just start carving and see what happens. My father used to say I thought better with my hands busy. May I try? The words surprised her, as much as they seemed to surprise him. Yates looked at her for a long moment, then handed over the half-carved wood and a smaller knife. Be careful, the blade is sharp. Natalie turned the wood in her hands, feeling its weight and texture. She had never carved anything in her life, but there was something appealing about the idea of creating something from raw material, of imposing order and shape on chaos. She made a tentative cut and a small shaving fell away. Like this? She asked. A bit more pressure, Yates said, moving to sit beside her on the settee. He guided her hands with his own, showing her the angle and motion. You want to work with the grain, not against it. They sat like that for over an hour, Yates teaching her the basics of wood carving while the fire crackled and the wind howled outside. His hands were warm over hers, his voice patient as he explained techniques and answered her questions. Natalie found herself hyper-aware of his nearness, the way he smelled like pine and leather, the way his breath stirred her hair when he leaned close to check her work. When Sarah came to collect her for dinner, Natalie realized with a start that she had not thought about Margaret or her father's death or her own near murder in over an hour. For the first time since her father had died, she had simply existed in a moment without grief or fear weighing on her. That night, lying in bed and listening to the house settle around her, Natalie acknowledged to herself that she was developing feelings for Yates Finnegan that went well beyond gratitude. It was foolish, she told herself. She had known him less than a week. He had saved her life and been kind to her, but that did not mean he saw her as anything more than a responsibility he had taken on. He was simply a good man doing what any decent person would do for someone in need. But then she remembered the way he looked at her sometimes when he thought she was not paying attention, an expression that was part wonder and part something deeper that made her breath catch. She remembered the gentle way he touched her, always careful, always respectful, but with a tenderness that seemed to go beyond simple compassion. In the morning, she woke to raised voices downstairs. Natalie dressed quickly, her movements still a bit stiff, and made her way down to find Yates arguing with a younger man who could only be his brother Marcus. They had the same dark hair and strong features, though Marcus was slightly shorter and had hazel eyes instead of brown. You cannot keep her here forever, Marcus was saying, his tone reasonable but firm. Eventually, people are going to ask questions. A single woman living in a house with 2 unmarried men, her reputation will be destroyed. Her reputation? Yates's voice was sharp with anger. Her stepmother tried to kill her, and you are worried about gossip? I am worried about practicality, Marcus shot back. I am not saying throw her out, Yates. I am saying we need to think about the future. What happens when she is fully healed? Where does she go? What does she do? Natalie cleared her throat and both men spun around, their faces flushing with embarrassment at being overheard. He is right, she said quietly. I have been thinking about the same thing. I cannot stay here indefinitely. You can stay as long as you need to, Yates said firmly. That is very kind, but your brother is correct about the impropriety. Natalie moved into the room, accepting the chair Marcus quickly pulled out for her. I need to figure out what I am going to do. I cannot go back to my father's ranch, not with Margaret there, and I have no other family, no one who would take me in. What about friends? Marcus asked. Or your father's friends? Surely someone in town would help you. Natalie shook her head. Margaret has been very careful to isolate me over the past months. The friends I had before my father remarried have all drifted away. Some of them tried to maintain contact, but Margaret made it so difficult that eventually they stopped trying. As for my father's friends, they are mostly older men who were business associates. They might be sympathetic, but none of them would offer to take in a young woman. Then you stay here, Yates said, his voice brooking no argument. We will figure out a way to make it proper. How? Natalie asked, your frustration creeping into her voice. She was grateful, desperately grateful, but she was also practical enough to know that Marcus was right. She could not simply live here as a charity case, relying on the Finnegan brothers' goodwill while the town gossiped about her. The silence stretched for a long moment. Then Marcus, his eyes moving between his brother and Natalie, said slowly, There is one way. If Natalie was engaged to one of you, it would be perfectly acceptable for her to live here as your future wife. Yates shot his brother a look that could have melted iron, but Marcus ignored him, warming to his theme. I am serious. An engagement would protect her reputation and give her a legitimate reason to be here. You would not have to actually get married right away. Just the appearance of a future marriage would be enough to satisfy propriety. That is ridiculous, Natalie said, though her heart was pounding hard enough that she thought they might hear it. You cannot ask either of them to fake an engagement for my sake. It does not have to be fake, Yates said quietly. Everyone turned to stare at him. He was looking directly at Natalie, his expression more serious than she had ever seen it. I know we have not known each other long, he continued, his words careful and deliberate. And I know that what I am about to say might seem crazy. But I care about you, Natalie, more than I probably should given that we met less than 2 weeks ago. If you would consider it, I would be honored if you would agree to marry me. A real marriage, not a pretend one. Natalie felt like all the air had been sucked from the room. She stared at Yates, trying to read his face, trying to understand if he was serious or if this was just an elaborate way to protect her. You do not have to do this, she whispered. I know I do not have to, Yates said. I want to. I wanted to ask you anyway, but I was trying to wait a respectful amount of time, trying not to take advantage of your situation. But if the question is being forced now, then my answer is the same as it would have been in a month or 6 months. I want you to stay. I want you to be my wife. Yates! His name came out as barely a breath. Natalie felt tears burning her eyes, but this time they were not tears of pain or grief. I care about you too, more than I thought possible in such a short time, but I need you to be sure. I need to know you are not just doing this out of some sense of obligation or because you feel sorry for me. He crossed the room and knelt in front of her chair, taking her hands in his. I am not asking out of obligation or pity. I am asking because when I found you in that snow, something in my chest cracked open. I am asking because every moment I spend with you makes me want 1,000 more. I am asking because I look at you and I see my future if you will have me. Marcus had quietly slipped from the room, giving them privacy. Natalie looked down at their joined hands, at the way Yates's calloused fingers wrapped around hers with such careful strength. She thought about the past week, about the way he had cared for her and listened to her and made her feel safe for the first time in months. She thought about the way her heart lifted every time he entered a room, the way his smile could make her forget, at least briefly, everything she had lost. Yes, she said, the word coming out clear and sure despite her tears. Yes, I will marry you. The smile that spread across Yates's face was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. He stood, pulling her gently to her feet, and wrapped his arms around her in a careful embrace, mindful of her still healing body. Natalie leaned into him, feeling the steady beat of his heart against her cheek, and let herself believe, for the first time since her father's death, that maybe her life was not over. Maybe it was just beginning. They were married 3 weeks later in a simple ceremony at the small church in Provo. Sarah stood up as Natalie's attendant, and Marcus stood with his brother. The pastor, a kindly man in his 60s who had known Yates since he was a boy, performed the ceremony with genuine warmth. Natalie wore a dress that had belonged to Yates's mother, altered by Sarah to fit her smaller frame. It was a beautiful gown of deep blue wool with delicate buttons up the back and lace at the collar. The question of Margaret had been handled with surprising efficiency. Yates and Marcus had gone into town to speak with the sheriff, taking Natalie with them to make her statement. The sheriff, a sharp-eyed man named Thomas Ward, had listened to her story with increasing anger. He had known Natalie's father and remembered her from when she was a girl. Margaret Rogers claimed you ran off to San Francisco, the sheriff said, his mouth tight with displeasure. Came in all tearful saying she woke up and you were gone, taken some clothes and money. Half the town felt sorry for her. The other half said you always were a flighty girl. I am not flighty, Natalie said, struggling to keep her voice level. I was left for dead. I believe you, Sheriff Ward said, and I am going to have some serious questions for your stepmother. Problem is, without more proof than your word against hers, it is going to be hard to make any charges stick. In the end, Sheriff Ward had gone out to the ranch with several deputies and confronted Margaret. Natalie did not know exactly what was said, but the result was that Margaret signed over Natalie's full inheritance in exchange for not facing attempted murder charges. It was not perfect justice, but it meant Natalie had the resources her father had intended for her, and Margaret left Utah Territory within a week, heading back east to family in Pennsylvania. She should be in prison, Yates had said angrily when the sheriff explained the outcome. Probably, Sheriff Ward agreed. But the reality is that juries do not like to convict women, especially well-spoken white women, of serious crimes. We could take it to trial and likely lose, or we could take this settlement and make sure Miss Rogers, Mrs. Finnegan, gets what is rightfully hers. I know which option I would take. So Natalie had her inheritance, a not insignificant sum that included the ranch property and her father's savings. She signed the ranch over to be sold, unable to bear the thought of returning to it with all its memories now tainted by what Margaret had done. The money from the sale, combined with what her father had left in the bank, meant she was bringing considerable resources to her marriage. I want to be clear, she told Yates the night before their wedding. This money is not why you are marrying me, but it is going to be part of our marriage. I want to use some of it to improve the ranch, to buy breeding stock or new equipment or whatever would be most helpful. The ranch is doing fine, Yates said. They were sitting on the porch in the cold January evening, bundled in coats and blankets, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. We are not rich, but we are not poor either. You do not need to contribute financially. I know I do not need to, Natalie said, but I want to. This is going to be my home, my life. I want to be a partner, not just a wife. Yates was quiet for a moment, then nodded. All right. We will sit down with Marcus and the account books and figure out where investment would do the most good. But Natalie, I need you to understand something. I did not marry you for your money. If you had come to me with nothing but the clothes on your back, I still would have married you in a heartbeat. I know, she said softly, reaching for his hand. I know that. But I also know that I need to feel like I am contributing something beyond just keeping house and cooking meals. I need to feel useful. You are useful, Yates said, squeezing her hand. You make me happier than I have been since my mother died. That is not nothing. The wedding night was gentle and sweet, Yates taking care to be patient with Natalie's nervousness. They had talked beforehand about her lack of experience, and he had assured her that there was no rush, that they had the rest of their lives to learn each other. He was true to his word, moving slowly and checking frequently to make sure she was comfortable. When it was over, Natalie lay in his arms, feeling overwhelmed by the intimacy of it all, the way their bodies had fit together, the way he had looked at her like she was something precious and perfect. Are you all right? He asked, his hand moving in slow circles on her back. Better than all right, she whispered, pressing a kiss to his shoulder. I love you, Yates Finnegan. She felt his sharp intake of breath, the way his arms tightened around her. I love you too, he said, his voice rough with emotion. God, Natalie, I love you so much. They settled into married life with surprising ease. Natalie took over running the household, working alongside Sarah to learn the rhythms of ranch life. She learned to bake bread and churn butter, to preserve vegetables and smoke meat. She learned which chickens were the best layers and how to tell when the weather was about to turn bad by watching the behavior of the horses. She learned to shoot, Yates teaching her with the same patience he had shown when teaching her to carve wood, because he said every rancher's wife needed to know how to protect herself and her home. Spring came slowly to the Utah mountains, the snow melting in fits and starts, revealing brown earth and the first green shoots of new growth. Natalie worked in the garden, planting seeds and feeling like she was also planting roots, establishing herself in this place and this life. She was happy in a way she had never quite been before, even in her childhood. The grief of losing her father was still there, a quiet ache that she suspected would never fully disappear, but it was balanced now by joy and purpose and love. In April, she realized she was pregnant. She told Yates on a warm evening when they were sitting by the creek that ran through the property, watching the water rush past, swollen with snowmelt. He stared at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable, and then let out a whoop of joy that startled the horses in the nearby pasture. He picked her up and spun her around, then immediately set her down again carefully, as if she might break. Are you sure? He asked, his hands on her shoulders, his eyes searching her face. As sure as I can be without seeing a doctor, Natalie said, laughing at his expression. I am about 6 weeks along, I think. A baby, Yates said wonderingly. We are going to have a baby. We are, Natalie confirmed. Are you happy? Happy does not begin to cover it, he said, pulling her close. A year ago, I was alone in this house, working the ranch and thinking that was all my life would ever be. And now I have you, and we are going to have a child. Natalie, you gave me back my future. The pregnancy progressed smoothly, though Natalie struggled with tiredness and nausea in the early months. Yates was attentive to the point of being comical, constantly asking if she needed anything, if she was comfortable, if she should be resting. Sarah laughed at him and told Natalie that men were always impossible during their wives' first pregnancies. Just wait until the baby actually arrives, Sarah said, her eyes twinkling. Then he will really lose his mind. Summer brought long days of hard work on the ranch, preparing for winter and managing the livestock. Natalie helped where she could, though as her belly grew, Yates became increasingly insistent that she not overdo things. They hired a young man from town to help with the heaviest work, using some of Natalie's inheritance money. Marcus had moved out in the spring, building a small house on the far edge of the property, giving Yates and Natalie privacy but staying close enough to help run the ranch. In October, when the aspens on the mountainsides turned gold and the air took on a crisp bite that promised snow, Natalie went into labor. It was a long and difficult process, lasting nearly 20 hours and leaving her exhausted and wrung out. But when the midwife finally placed a squalling, red-faced baby in her arms, Natalie felt a rush of love so intense it bordered on pain. It is a boy, the midwife announced, beaming. A healthy, strong boy with good lungs, as you can hear. Yates, who had been pacing the hallway for the last several hours, burst into the room and stopped short at the sight of his wife and newborn son. He approached the bed slowly, almost reverently, and looked down at the tiny face peeking out from the blankets. He's perfect, Yates whispered. Natalie, he is perfect. We made a person, Natalie said, still somewhat in awe of the fact. Yates, we made a whole entire person. They named him Thomas William Finnegan, after both his grandfathers. He was, as the midwife had noted, a healthy and strong child with a powerful set of lungs that he was not shy about using. Those first few weeks were a blur of feeding and changing and trying to snatch sleep whenever the baby allowed. Natalie discovered reserves of strength and patience she had not known she possessed, and Yates proved to be a devoted and hands-on father, walking the floor with Thomas at all hours of the night when he was fussy. I do not know how people do this multiple times, Natalie said one night, or rather early morning, when she was feeding Thomas for what felt like the 100th time. I am so tired I can barely see straight. It gets easier, Yates said from where he sat beside her, ready to take the baby when she was done so she could try to get some sleep. That is what Sarah says anyway. Sarah has 5 children, Natalie said. She is either lying or insane. But Sarah was right. As the weeks passed, Thomas settled into something resembling a routine, and Natalie began to feel more like herself again. She loved being a mother, loved watching her son discover the world, loved the way Yates's face lit up when he held his child. She had not forgotten the darkness of the previous winter, the cold and terror of being left to die, but those memories felt distant now, like something that had happened to a different person. The years passed in the steady rhythm of ranch life. Thomas grew from a baby into a sturdy toddler, and then into a bright, energetic little boy who followed his father everywhere and asked endless questions about everything. When he was 3, Natalie became pregnant again, and this time she gave birth to a daughter they named Caroline Rose. 2 years after that came another son, James Marcus, named for Yates's father and brother. Marcus himself married in the spring of 1888, bringing home a sweet-natured woman from Salt Lake City named Elizabeth. They built a larger house on Marcus's portion of the property and started their own family, eventually having 3 children of their own. The 2 families were close, the cousins growing up more like siblings, running between the 2 houses and helping with ranch work as soon as they were old enough. Natalie continued to be deeply involved in running the ranch, her business sense and careful management helping to expand their operations. They bought more land, increased their herds, and built a reputation for producing some of the finest horses in the territory. She taught school to her children at home, determined that they would have good educations, and was surprised to discover she had a talent for teaching. Eventually, other families in the area asked if she would teach their children too, and she started a small school in the front room of the ranch house. It was never more than 10 students, ranging in age from 5 to 14, but Natalie found deep satisfaction in watching them learn and grow. Yates teased her that she was trying to educate all of Utah single-handedly, but she could tell he was proud of her. "You are remarkable, you know that?" he said one evening when they were alone, the children finally asleep, the house quiet around them. They were sitting on the porch as they often did on summer nights, watching lightning flash in the distance over the mountains. "I am ordinary," Natalie protested. "I am just a rancher's wife and a mother and a teacher." "You are a woman who survived something that should have killed her," Yates said seriously. "You are a woman who turned that survival into a full and meaningful life. You took all the pain and fear and grief and turned it into love and purpose. That is not ordinary, Natalie. That is extraordinary." She leaned against him, feeling the solid warmth of his body, the steady beat of his heart beneath her cheek. "I could not have done any of it without you," she said softly. "You saved my life, Yates. In every way a person can be saved." "We saved each other," he said, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "I was just existing before I found you, going through the motions of living without really feeling alive. You gave me purpose and joy and a reason to want tomorrow to come." In 1895, 11 years after Yates had found Natalie half frozen in the snow, Utah became a state. There were celebrations in every town, parades and speeches, and a general sense of excitement about the future. The Finnegan family went into Provo for the festivities, Thomas now 11, and carefully watching over his younger siblings, Caroline at 8, already showing signs of inheriting her mother's sharp mind and independent spirit, and James at 6, still young enough to want to hold his father's hand as they walked through the crowded streets. "Do you remember the first time we came to town together?" Yates asked Natalie as they watched the children eat peppermint sticks purchased from a vendor. "When I had to give my statement to the sheriff," Natalie said. "I was so scared, scared that no one would believe me, scared that Margaret would somehow escape justice entirely, scared that I was going to lose everything." "Instead, you gained everything," Yates said, gesturing to their children, to the life they had built. "We gained everything," Natalie corrected. She looked around at the celebrating crowds, at the flags flying, and the bunting hanging from every building, and felt a deep sense of contentment. This was her home, these mountains and valleys, this town and the ranch beyond it. These were her people, the neighbors and friends who had welcomed her and accepted her, who had supported her small school and bought horses from their ranch and become part of the fabric of her life. That night, back at the ranch with the children finally asleep after the excitement of the day, Natalie and Yates sat on the porch and looked up at the stars scattered across the vast darkness of the sky. The air was cool and sweet, carrying the scent of hay and horses and the wild roses that grew along the fence line. "Do you ever think about that day?" Natalie asked quietly. "The day you found me?" "Sometimes," Yates admitted. "I think about how easily I could have taken a different road that day, how I almost decided not to ride out at all because of the weather. I think about how many things had to align perfectly for me to be in exactly the right place at exactly the right time." "Fate," Natalie said. "Maybe," Yates agreed. "Or maybe just luck. Either way, I am grateful for it. Every single day, I am grateful." "I used to be so angry," Natalie said, surprising herself with the admission. "After my father died, after Margaret showed her true colors, I was so angry at the unfairness of it all. Why did my mother have to die? Why did my father have to remarry? Why did he have to choose someone like Margaret? Why did I have to suffer for other people's choices?" "That is understandable," Yates said. "But I am not angry anymore," Natalie continued. "I have been thinking about this a lot lately. If even one thing had been different, if my father had not remarried, or if he had chosen someone else, or if Margaret had been less cruel, I would not be here right now. I would not have married you. We would not have Thomas and Caroline and James. And I cannot regret anything that led me to this life, even the painful parts." Yates pulled her close, and they sat in comfortable silence for a long time, listening to the night sounds of the ranch, the distant lowing of cattle, the soft whinny of a horse in the barn, the whisper of wind through the grass. "I love you," Yates said eventually. "I loved you from the moment I saw you in that snow, this fragile, broken thing that refused to die. I loved you when you woke up and looked at me like I was the only solid thing in a world that had tried to destroy you. I loved you when you agreed to marry me, and I have loved you more every single day since." "I love you too," Natalie said, turning to kiss him, tasting the sweetness of peppermint on his lips from the candy he had been sharing with James earlier. "I love you, and I love this life we have built, and I love the future we are going to have." The years continued to pass, each one bringing its own joys and challenges. There were hard winters and dry summers, years when the cattle prices were low and they had to tighten their belts, years when illness swept through the valley and they counted themselves lucky that their family was spared. But there were far more good times than bad, long summers of hard work followed by harvest festivals and winter nights gathered around the fire telling stories. Thomas grew into a serious, responsible young man who loved the ranch and wanted nothing more than to follow in his father's footsteps. Caroline proved to be as fierce and independent as her mother, with a passion for learning that eventually led her to attend a teaching college in Salt Lake City. James was the sweet one, the peacemaker, the child who brought home injured animals and cried when they had to slaughter chickens. In 1901, when Natalie was 40 years old and had long since assumed her childbearing years were behind her, she discovered she was pregnant again. The news was met with mixed emotions. She was excited but also anxious, aware that women her age faced increased risks during pregnancy and childbirth. Yates was openly worried, though he tried to hide it, and their children ranged from Thomas's protective concern to James's uncomplicated delight at the prospect of a new sibling. The pregnancy was more difficult than her previous ones, and the birth, when it finally came in late January of 1902, was harrowing. For several hours, the midwife looked increasingly worried, and the doctor who had been summoned from town spoke in low, urgent tones about complications. Natalie drifted in and out of consciousness, aware only of pain and the distant sound of Yates's voice, tight with fear, asking over and over if she was going to be all right. But when it was over, when she held her fourth child, another daughter they named Grace Margaret, Natalie felt the same overwhelming love she had experienced with each of her babies. The choice of middle name raised some eyebrows, but Natalie was firm in her decision. "That name does not belong to my stepmother anymore," she told Yates when he questioned her choice. "It belonged to my grandmother, who by all accounts was a kind and generous woman. I am taking it back. I am giving it to our daughter, and she is going to fill it with goodness and light, and that will be the legacy of the name Margaret in this family." Grace was an easy baby, placid and content, with her father's dark eyes and her mother's fine features. She grew up adored by her older siblings, particularly James, who took his role as her protector very seriously. The age gap meant she was almost raised as an only child, her older siblings already entering adulthood by the time she was old enough to remember them properly, but she never seemed lonely or neglected. As the new century progressed, the world began to change in ways that sometimes made Natalie feel old. Telephones and automobiles appeared, though they were still rare enough in rural Utah to be objects of wonder. Thomas married in 1906, bringing home a rancher's daughter from a neighboring valley, and they built a house on the property and started their own family. Caroline returned from college and took over Natalie's school, expanding it and eventually helping to establish a proper schoolhouse in town. James surprised everyone by expressing interest in studying veterinary medicine, and Yates used some of their savings to send him to college in Colorado. He came back 4 years later with a degree and a quiet, red-haired wife, and set up a practice that served ranchers throughout the valley. Through it all, Natalie and Yates remained the steady center of their growing family. They were the grandparents who spoiled their grandchildren, the parents who offered advice and support when needed, the partners who still looked at each other across a crowded room and smiled like they were sharing a secret. On a cold January morning in 1924, exactly 40 years after Yates had found Natalie in the snow, they rode together up into the mountains. It was something they did every year on their anniversary, a pilgrimage of sorts to the place where their story had begun. The road had been improved over the years, and what had once been a treacherous mountain pass was now a well-maintained route, but they could still find the spot where Natalie had been left to die. It was marked now by a small cairn of stones that Yates had built years ago, a memorial not to death, but to survival and second chances. They stood beside it, their breaths creating clouds in the frigid air, holding hands with the ease of 4 decades of marriage. 40 years, Natalie said wonderingly. She was 62 now, her dark hair shot through with silver, her face lined with the evidence of a life well lived. 40 years since you found me. Best day of my life, Yates said. He was 65, his hair fully gray, his body still strong from years of ranch work, but moving with the careful deliberation of age. The day I found you, and the day you agreed to marry me, and every day since. We have had a good life, Natalie said. A full life. We have, Yates agreed. 4 children, 9 grandchildren so far, with more probably coming, a successful ranch, good friends, good health. We have been blessed. Natalie thought about that girl who had lain in this very spot 40 years ago, broken and freezing and certain she was going to die. She thought about all the ways her life could have gone, all the paths not taken. She thought about Margaret, who she had heard died alone in Pennsylvania 5 years ago, bitter and impoverished, having alienated everyone who might have cared for her. There was no satisfaction in knowing her stepmother had ultimately suffered for her cruelty, only a kind of sad resignation that some people never learned how to accept love or offer it. "Do you have any regrets?" Natalie asked Yates. He considered the question seriously, as he always did. "Small ones," he said eventually. "I wish I had been brave enough to tell you I loved you sooner. I wish I had been able to protect you from ever being hurt in the first place. But the big things? No. I would do it all again exactly the same if it meant ending up here with you." "Even the scary parts?" Natalie asked, thinking of Grace's difficult birth, of the year Thomas had been sick with pneumonia and nearly died, of the drought that had almost broken them financially before the rains finally came. "Even the scary parts," Yates confirmed, "because we got through them together, and that made us stronger." They stood for a while longer, then turned and rode back down the mountain toward home. The ranch house was visible long before they reached it, smoke rising from the chimney, lights glowing in the windows. They could see people moving around in the yard, Thomas and his oldest son working with a young horse, Caroline's automobile parked beside the barn, James's wife hanging laundry despite the cold. "Our family," Yates said, and there was such pride and love in his voice that Natalie felt tears sting her eyes. "Our family," she agreed. That evening, the whole family gathered for a celebration of Natalie and Yates's 40th wedding anniversary. The house was full to bursting with children and grandchildren, with Sarah and William and Elizabeth, with friends and neighbors who had become like family over the decades. There was food and laughter and music, Thomas playing the fiddle he had learned from his grandfather, Caroline's oldest daughter singing in a clear, sweet voice that reminded Natalie of her own mother. Grace, now 22 and engaged to a young man who owned a hardware store in Provo, stood up and called for everyone's attention. "I want to make a toast," she said, raising her glass, "to my parents, who have shown all of us what love really looks like. Not just the romantic kind, though they have plenty of that, but the everyday kind. The kind that shows up when someone is sick, the kind that listens when someone needs to talk, the kind that works hard to build a good life and then shares that life generously with everyone around them." She paused, her eyes finding her mother's across the room. "Most of you know that my mother almost died before she ever had a chance to marry my father, before she had a chance to build this life. She survived something terrible, and instead of letting it make her bitter or afraid, she turned it into strength. She taught us that survival is not just about living through something, but about what you do with the life you are given after. So here is to survival and to second chances and to building something beautiful out of the ashes of what could have been tragedy. Here's to my parents, Natalie and Yates Finnegan." The room erupted in cheers and applause. Natalie, tears streaming openly down her face now, stood and embraced her youngest daughter, then her husband, then found herself passed from hug to hug around the room, each person wanting to share in the celebration. Later, when the party had wound down and the guests had left and the children and grandchildren had settled into various rooms throughout the house, Natalie and Yates sat alone in their bedroom. It was the same room where Yates had kept vigil over her 40 years ago, though it had been redecorated many times since then. The bed was the same, sturdy oak that Yates's father had built, and Natalie ran her hand over the carved footboard, thinking about all the nights she had slept in this bed, all the mornings she had woken here. "What are you thinking about?" Yates asked, emerging from the adjoining dressing room in his nightshirt. "Everything," Natalie said. "I am thinking about how strange life is, how unpredictable, how the worst day of my life led directly to all the best days, how pain and joy are so tangled together that sometimes you cannot separate them." "That is too philosophical for this time of night," Yates said, but he was smiling. He climbed into bed beside her and pulled her close, their bodies fitting together with the unconscious ease of decades. "What are you really thinking about?" "I am thinking about how much I love you." Natalie said simply. How after 40 years, I still get a little flutter in my chest when you walk into a room. How I still find excuses to touch you, to hold your hand or lean against your shoulder. How I still want to tell you every thought in my head and hear every thought in yours. The feeling is mutual, Yates said, pressing a kiss to her forehead. After 40 years, you are still the most interesting person I know. You are still the first person I want to talk to when something happens, good or bad. You are still the person who makes me want to be better, to do more, to live more fully. They lay in the darkness, listening to the sounds of their family settling down for the night, the creak of floorboards, the distant sound of someone laughing, the closer sound of Grace singing softly to herself in the next room. This house that had once seemed so empty when it held only Yates and Marcus now overflowed with life and love and the evidence of a family built with intention and care. Do you think we will have another 40 years? Natalie asked, only half joking. I certainly plan to try, Yates said, though we might need to slow down a bit. I am not as young as I used to be. None of us are, Natalie said. But that is all right. We have earned our gray hair and our creaky joints. We have earned the right to sit on the porch and watch the sunset instead of working from dawn to dusk. We have earned our rest. But rest, as it turned out, was not really in either of their natures. They continued to be active participants in the ranch and in their families' lives for many more years. They attended weddings and births, celebrated successes, and mourned losses. They watched their grandchildren grow up and start having children of their own, great-grandchildren who called them great-grandma and great-grandpa, and climbed onto their laps to hear stories about the old days. The stories they told were carefully curated. They talked about building the ranch, about the hard winters and the good years, about horses they had loved, and neighbors who had become friends. They talked about their wedding and the birth of their children. But they did not talk, especially not to the younger children, about how Natalie and Yates had met. That story was saved for when the children were older, old enough to understand darkness as well as light, old enough to appreciate the miracle of survival and second chances. In the spring of 1934, Yates fell ill with pneumonia. He had always been strong and healthy, still riding and working at 75 years old, and the sickness came on fast and hard. For 2 weeks, he lay in their bed burning with fever, while Natalie sat beside him, bathing his face with cool cloths and refusing to leave except when absolutely necessary. The whole family gathered, generations of Finnegans filling the house, waiting and hoping and praying. On the 14th day, the fever broke. Yates opened his eyes, lucid for the first time in days, and found Natalie asleep in the chair beside his bed, her hand holding his, her face drawn with exhaustion and worry. He squeezed her hand gently, and she woke immediately, her eyes going wide when she saw him looking at her. You are back, she whispered. I am back, he confirmed, his voice hoarse from disuse. I could not leave you. Not yet. He recovered slowly, his body weakened by the illness, and for the first time, they both had to acknowledge that they were truly old now, that their bodies were failing in ways that will and determination could not overcome. They moved more slowly, tired more easily, needed more help with the daily tasks they had always handled themselves, but their minds remained sharp and their love remained strong, and they faced aging with the same partnership they had brought to every other challenge. On a warm June evening in 1936, they sat together on the porch, watching the sun set behind the mountains. The air was soft and sweet with the scent of blooming flowers, and in the distance they could hear children playing, great-grandchildren running through the fields as their own children had once done. Yates reached for Natalie's hand, and she gave it, their fingers intertwining with the easy familiarity of 52 years of marriage. Do you remember the first time we sat here together? Yates asked. Which time? Natalie replied. We have sat here together thousands of times. The first time, Yates insisted, when you were still healing, when we were just beginning to fall in love. I remember, Natalie said softly. I remember thinking that I had never felt so safe, so cherished. I remember thinking that maybe my life was not over after all. Your life was just beginning, Yates said. Our life was just beginning. They sat in peaceful silence as the sky turned from gold to pink to deep purple, as the stars began to emerge one by one, as the day gave way to night. They had seen this sunset thousands of times from this exact spot, had watched the seasons change and the years pass, had built a life and a family and a legacy that would continue long after they were gone. I am grateful, Natalie said quietly, for all of it. For you finding me, for you loving me, for every single day we have had together. I am grateful too, Yates said. You gave me everything, Natalie. You gave me purpose and joy and a reason to wake up every morning. You gave me children and grandchildren and a life so full and rich, I could never have imagined it before you came along. We gave each other everything, Natalie corrected gently. That is what love is. Not one person saving another, but two people building something together that neither could have built alone. The night deepened around them, and eventually they went inside, climbing the stairs to their bedroom with careful, measured steps. They helped each other prepare for bed, a routine so practiced it required no thought, and climbed beneath the quilts that had been made by their daughters and daughters-in-law, each stitch a labor of love. Good night, Yates, Natalie whispered, curling against his side. Good night, Natalie, he replied, his arm coming around her. I love you. I love you too. They slept, and in the morning, they woke together as they had for 52 years, ready to face another day of the life they had built from snow and second chances, from survival and stubborn hope, from love that had started as a fragile spark and grown into an unquenchable flame that warmed not just them, but everyone fortunate enough to be part of their world. Yates Finnegan died peacefully in his sleep in the winter of 1938, 3 weeks after his 79th birthday. Natalie woke to find him beside her, his face peaceful, his hand still holding hers. The grief was enormous, a physical weight that pressed on her chest and made breathing difficult, but alongside it was gratitude. They had 54 years together, 5 decades of partnership and love and building a life that mattered. The funeral was attended by what seemed like half of Utah, the church overflowing with family and friends and people whose lives Yates had touched in ways large and small. Thomas gave the eulogy, his voice breaking as he talked about his father's kindness and integrity, his devotion to his family, his unshakable principles. Grace read a poem she had written, and Caroline led everyone in singing Yates's favorite hymn. Natalie sat in the front pew, surrounded by her children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, and felt the full weight of the legacy she and Yates had created together. This was what survival looked like. This was what happened when you refused to let darkness win, when you took the love someone offered and built something beautiful with it. She lived for another 7 years, remaining sharp and active despite her advanced age. She spent her days with her family, teaching the youngest great-grandchildren to read, working in her garden, sitting on the porch and telling stories to anyone who would listen. She talked about Yates often, keeping his memory alive, making sure the younger generations knew the kind of man he had been. On January 15th, 1945, 61 years to the day after Yates had found her in the snow, Natalie Rogers Finnegan died quietly in her sleep. She was 83 years old, surrounded by photographs of her family, in the house that had been her home for 6 decades. Her children found her in the morning, a peaceful smile on her face, her hand resting on the pillow beside her where Yates had once slept. They buried her beside him on a hill overlooking the ranch, under a large cottonwood tree that they had planted together in the spring of 1885. The headstone was simple granite, carved with their names and dates and a single line that Grace had suggested. Together they built something beautiful. The ranch continued to be run by their descendants, passing from generation to generation, each adding their own contributions while honoring the foundation that Natalie and Yates had established. The story of how they met became family legend, told and retold, the details sometimes embellished, but the essential truth remaining the same. A woman had been left to die in the cold, and a man had found her and helped her heal, and from that terrible beginning had come love and life and a legacy that touched hundreds of people across multiple generations. The small cairn of stones on the mountain pass remained, added to over the years by family members who made the pilgrimage to see where it all began. It became a tradition for newlywed couples in the family to visit the spot, to stand where Natalie had nearly died and Yates had found her, to remember that love could bloom even in the harshest conditions, that second chances were possible, that survival was just the beginning of the story, not the end. And on cold January nights, when the wind howled down from the mountains and snow covered the land in white silence, the descendants of Natalie and Yates Finnegan gathered in the old ranch house around the fire and told the story again. They told it to teach resilience and hope, to honor the woman who had refused to die and the man who had given her a reason to live, to celebrate the love that had started with a desperate rescue and grown into something that shaped all of their lives. They told the story because it was true, and because truth, especially truth about survival and love and the building of beautiful things from broken pieces, was worth preserving. They told it because Natalie and Yates deserved to be remembered, not just as names on a headstone, but as real people who had faced impossible odds and chosen love anyway, who had taken the worst thing that could happen and transformed it into the best thing, who had proven that sometimes the end of one story is really just the beginning of another, better one. And in the telling, in the remembering, in the continuation of the family and the ranch and the values that Natalie and Yates had lived by, their story never truly ended. It just kept growing, branching out like the roots of the cottonwood tree that shaded their graves, touching new lives, inspiring new love stories, proving again and again that even in the coldest winter, even in the darkest moment, hope could survive, love could thrive, and second chances could become whole lifetimes of joy.